All right, so get this. Picture a school district. Like, imagine it, where almost every single student graduates ready for university.
Wow.
That's what's happening right now in Johannesburg, West, South Africa.
I know, it's incredible.
We're diving deep into South Africa's latest Matric results, their big high school exit exam. And trust me, there's a lot more to uncover than just the headline numbers.
Definitely.
We've got some fascinating data here, official reports, statistics, all sorts of expert analysis, and we're going to unpack it all.
Yep.
But before we get lost in the numbers, for those who aren't familiar with the South African education system, can you give us a quick rundown on what Matric is and why these results are such a big deal?
Absolutely. So Matric is essentially the culmination of 12 years of schooling in South Africa.
Okay.
It's not just a graduation requirement. Those scores determine access to higher education and ultimately influence a student's future career prospects.
Huge.
So, yeah, these results have a ripple effect throughout the country.
And this year, those ripples are looking pretty positive, right? Almost half of the students who passed this year qualified for bachelor's degrees.
Exactly.
That's a huge leap forward for access to higher education.
It is, and that's a critical piece of the puzzle for South Africa's economic development.
Yeah.
A more educated workforce opens up so many possibilities.
So we've got this incredible success story in Johannesburg West. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the bigger picture.
Okay.
You mentioned it before, the national pass rate soared to 87.3%.
It did.
That's going to be cause for celebration, right?
Definitely a reason to celebrate progress. But as with any complex issue, it's essential to look beyond the surface.
Okay.
For instance, we see variations in performance when we analyze results by province.
Oh, interesting.
The Free State, KwaZulu-Natal, and Gauteng all stand out with pass rates well above the national average.
So different provinces, different outcomes.
Yeah.
What's driving that? Is it just about resources or are there other factors at play?
It's a mix of things. Resources definitely matter. Things like textbooks, technology, well-trained teachers.
Right.
But we also need to consider the socio-economic context of each province, even down to the district level.
Right.
For example, how does poverty or access to quality early childhood education impact a student's chances of success down the line?
It sounds like we need to unpack this idea of quintiles. You mentioned that earlier.
Uh-huh.
What are they, and how do they help us understand the bigger picture?
Right, good point. So South Africa uses a system called quintiles to categorize schools based on the socioeconomic conditions of the communities they serve.
Great.
Quintile 1 schools are in the most disadvantaged areas,
Got it.
while Quintile 5 schools are in the most affluent.
Interesting.
This system allows policymakers and researchers to analyze performance trends across different socioeconomic groups.
So by looking at the Matric results through the lens of these quintiles, we can get a clearer sense of whether educational opportunities are truly becoming more equitable?
Yeah.
Is that what we're seeing?
That's the goal. And while the overall picture is improving, significant gaps persist.
Oh, okay.
For example, while the national pass rate for mathematics jumped to 69.1%, a closer look reveals a different story when we analyze those results by quintile.
Oh, really?
Students in lower quintiles are still lagging behind their peers in more affluent areas.
That makes sense, but it's also a bit disheartening.
Yeah.
I mean, celebrating those national improvements is great, but knowing those disparities exist, it's a reminder that there's still a long way to go.
Absolutely. And that's why it's crucial to analyze these results in detail.
Yeah.
The headline number is just the starting point. We need to dig deeper, explore those nuances, and understand how factors like socioeconomic background and access to quality teaching impact a student's educational journey.
Speaking of teaching, I'm curious about the subject-specific trends we see in these results.
Okay.
We talked about the improvement in maths, but there was also a slight dip in physical sciences, right?
There was.
What's going on there?
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
While it's just a small dip, it raises some important questions.
Like what?
Is it a blip, or does it reflect a broader trend? Could it be related to changes in the curriculum, teaching methods, or even resource allocation? It definitely warrants further investigation.
Yeah, what's fascinating to me is that Johannesburg West, with its 97% pass rate, seems to be bucking those national trends in a positive way.
Yeah.
They're excelling in maths, physical sciences, across the board. Really,
That's impressive.
what's their secret sauce?
That's precisely the kind of question we should be asking.
I think so too.
What specific strategies are they implementing that are contributing to their success? Could those be replicated in other districts?
So instead of just looking at the numbers, we need to figure out the why behind those numbers.
Exactly.
What are they doing differently? What can we learn from their approach? I'm already starting to think about some follow-up research for this deep dive.
Great.
And that brings us to another critical piece of the puzzle.
Okay.
How does South Africa's educational performance stack up on the international stage?
Yeah, the global perspective. Always important.
But I know we run into the data lag issue here. It can be tough to find up-to-date comparisons.
It's true. The most recent data we have from international assessments like TIMSS and PRLs, which measure maths and literacy skills, are a few years old.
Okay, so we have to acknowledge that data limitation.
Uh-huh.
But even with older data, can we still glean some insights into where South Africa stands globally?
Absolutely. While we have to be cautious about making direct comparisons,
Right.
those older assessments suggest that South Africa still has some ground to make up in key areas like maths and science compared to other countries.
Okay.
And that raises some important questions about the curriculum, teaching methods, and the overall preparedness of students for a globalized world.
That's a crucial point, preparing students not just for exams, but for the real world.
Exactly.
So even with the data limitations, it sounds like those international comparisons offer valuable food for thought.
They do, and they highlight the need for continued effort and innovation in South Africa's education system. It's not just about catching up. It's about striving for excellence on a global scale.
And that brings us back to those success stories,
Right.
like Johannesburg West, that give us a glimpse of what's possible.
Yeah.
If they can achieve such incredible results, maybe it's not just a dream to think that other districts, other provinces can follow suit.
Exactly, and that's where things get really exciting.
Okay.
We need to dissect those success stories, figure out what's working, and explore how those strategies can be adapted and implemented in different contexts.
All right, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've celebrated South Africa's record-high Matric pass rate,
Yep.
but we've also dug deeper, exploring the nuances and disparities hidden beneath the surface. We've analyzed subject-specific trends, considered the impact of socio-economic factors, and even peeked into the global arena.
We have.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yes. What's on your mind?
I keep thinking about something you mentioned earlier, the importance of not just looking at whether students pass, but at the quality of that pass.
Right.
What does that really mean? How do we measure whether those Matric scores truly translate into the skills and knowledge students need to succeed?
That's where things get even more interesting. So we often talk about 21st century skills, critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, creativity.
Okay.
Those are the abilities that employers are clamoring for, regardless of the specific industry.
Right.
But traditional exams, even Matric, don't always capture those skills effectively.
So we're talking about moving beyond rote memorization and ticking boxes on a multiple choice test.
Exactly. It's about assessing whether students can apply their knowledge in real-world scenarios, analyze information critically, and come up with innovative solutions to complex problems.
Yeah.
That's what will prepare them not just for university, but for a rapidly evolving job market.
Okay, I'm on board with that idea, but how do we actually measure those more nuanced skills? It's not like we can just slap a ruler on someone's creativity.
Right. It requires a shift in assessment methods. We're seeing a move towards more project-based learning, where students tackle real-world challenges and develop solutions collaboratively.
Well,
There's also a growing emphasis on portfolio assessments, where students showcase their work over time,
yeah.
demonstrating not just their knowledge, but also their growth and ability to apply their skills in different contexts.
That sounds way more engaging for students, too.
Right.
It's like real-world learning, not just prepping for a test.
Absolutely, and it aligns with what employers are looking for. They need graduates who can think critically, solve problems creatively, and work effectively in teams. All those skills you've highlighted.
This is making me rethink how we measure success in education.
Yeah.
It's not just about those pass rates, but about equipping students with the skills and knowledge they need to thrive in a rapidly changing world.
I couldn't agree more. It's about fostering a lifelong love of learning and empowering students to be active, engaged citizens who can contribute meaningfully to society.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for more holistic assessments, but I also want to bring back this idea of international comparisons.
Okay.
You mentioned that the data we have is a bit outdated. Beyond simply waiting for newer data, are there other ways South Africa can benchmark its education system and identify areas for improvement?
That's a fantastic question.
Yeah.
And it speaks to a broader point about the limitations of relying solely on standardized tests, even when the data is up to date.
Okay.
Every country has its unique context,
Yeah.
so direct comparisons can only tell us so much.
So how do we move beyond just comparing test scores? What are some alternative approaches?
One promising avenue is looking at educational best practices in other countries, not just in terms of test scores, but in terms of pedagogical approaches, curriculum design, and teacher training.
Okay.
For example, what can South Africa learn from countries like Finland or Singapore, which consistently rank high in international assessments? What are they doing differently, and how might those approaches be adapted to the South African context?
I love that idea, not just comparing numbers, but comparing strategies.
Yeah.
It's like taking a peek inside the classroom and seeing what's actually happening.
Exactly. It's about learning from the successes and challenges of other countries,
Right.
understanding the why behind their outcomes, and then figuring out what might be relevant and adaptable to South Africa's unique circumstances.
And that brings us back to the need for ongoing research and analysis. It's not just about collecting data. It's about using that data to inform better policies, better teaching practices, and ultimately, better outcomes for students.
I couldn't have said it better myself. Data without analysis is just noise.
Right.
We need to translate those numbers into actionable insights that can drive positive change.
Speaking of driving change, I want to go back to something we touched on earlier, the role of communities in supporting education.
Yeah.
It's easy to focus on the schools and the teachers, but it sounds like families, communities, and even businesses have a crucial part to play.
They absolutely do. We can't expect schools to shoulder the entire burden of educating our children.
Yeah.
It takes a village, as they say.
Right.
And that means creating a supportive ecosystem where everyone is invested in the success of our learners.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some concrete ways that communities can support education?
Well, for starters, parents can be more actively engaged in their children's education, attending school events, volunteering in classrooms, or simply talking to their kids about what they're learning.
It sounds so simple,
Yeah.
but just that communication and involvement can make a world of difference, right?
Absolutely. Then there's the role of community organizations.
Right.
They can provide after-school programs, mentoring opportunities, or even just safe spaces for students to study and socialize.
And what about the role of businesses? I imagine they have a stake in this too.
For sure, businesses need a skilled workforce.
Yeah.
So it's in their best interest to support education initiatives. They can do this by offering internships, apprenticeships, or even just guest speakers to share their expertise with students.
So it's about breaking down those silos between schools, communities, and the business world and creating a more collaborative approach to education.
Precisely. When we all work together, we can create a more supportive and enriching learning environment for all students.
You know, this conversation reminds me of something we often say on this show. Knowledge is most powerful when it's shared.
Yes.
And it seems like that applies not just to the information we're exploring here, but to the very act of learning itself.
I love that connection. It's true. When we share our knowledge, our resources, our support, we create a ripple effect that can have a profound impact on the lives of learners.
And that brings us back to the heart of this deep dive.
Okay.
We're not just analyzing numbers, we're exploring the human stories behind those numbers. We're looking at the factors that influence educational success and recognizing that it's a collective effort. It's about empowering learners, supporting their growth, and creating a future where everyone had the opportunity to thrive.
That's beautifully said, and it makes me feel so optimistic about the future of education, not just in South Africa, but around the world.
Speaking of optimism, I think it's time to shift our focus to the individuals at the center of this whole conversation, the learners themselves.
Okay.
We've talked about all the support systems around them,
Yeah.
but what about their own role in shaping their educational journey?
Excellent point. It's easy to focus on external factors, the resources, the policies.
Uh-huh.
But ultimately, learners have agency in their own education.
Okay, let's explore that. What does it mean for learners to have agency in their own education?
It means they're not just passive recipients of knowledge, but active participants in the learning process.
Yeah.
They have a voice, they can ask questions, challenge assumptions, and explore their own interests.
So it's not just about absorbing information. It's about actively shaping their own learning experience.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly empowering for learners when they feel like they have a voice. You know, when they're encouraged to ask questions, to explore their interests, to take ownership of their learning, that's when we see real magic happen.
It reminds me of that famous quote, tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. It's about that active involvement, that sense of ownership.
Precisely, and it goes beyond just individual learning. When learners feel empowered, they can also contribute to a more positive and supportive learning environment for their peers. They can collaborate, share ideas, and inspire each other to reach their full potential.
So it's like a virtuous cycle. Empowered learners create a more thriving learning environment, which in turn empowers even more learners.
Exactly. And that's what makes me so excited about the future of education. When we shift our focus from simply transmitting knowledge to fostering a love of learning, to empowering learners to be active participants in their own educational journey, that's when we unlock truly transformative possibilities.
Well said. And on that inspiring note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
Hmm.
We've journeyed from celebrating South Africa's impressive Matric results to delving into the complexities of educational success. And we've even challenged ourselves to think differently about the very nature of learning itself.
It's been a fascinating exploration, and I hope our listeners are leaving with a renewed appreciation for the multifaceted nature of education and the power of collective effort in shaping a brighter future for learners everywhere.
I think that's the perfect takeaway. It's not just about the numbers, it's about the people. It's about recognizing that education is a journey, and it's a journey we take together. So to our listener, as you continue to explore this topic, I encourage you to think about the role you can play in supporting learners and creating a more vibrant and equitable learning environment, whether it's in your own community or on a broader scale, because ultimately investing in education is investing in our collective future.